Hey, Alex and Pat, are y'all able to unmute yourself now? Do you have the ability to do that?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. I think I figured it out. I think just when you enable the feature, it then mutes everybody, but now I think only we have mic again. So I think we should be good.
Sweet.
See you in a minute. Hi, everyone. I think we're gonna have people trickling in over the next few minutes. It looks like the live stream is working. We have one whole viewer over on the live stream, so I think I'm gonna. It is also running off of my Wi-Fi in addition to everybody on the call right now. So I think I'm gonna see how it goes and how many people we have on it. And if it turns out to be siphoning too much data, I might just encourage people just to join over here because it might be using quite a bit. But we'll see how it goes. Um, but yeah, should we take it away? Are you all able to unmute? Okay, cool. I will let you all take the lead for a bit while I manage tech.
Sweet. Welcome, everyone. Welcome those who are joining right now. All right. So today's session is towards abolitionist praxis, and we have Parth joining us today. And the idea, similar to previous Liberate Mental Health events, those of you who have attended previously, over the 2 hours, the first hour will kind of be a conversation primarily between myself, John, and Parth, but we also invite some comments in the chat as well. And it'll be under sort of the topic of today. And then we'll take a brief 5-minute break in between. And in that second hour, we'll invite open discussion and dialogue and free associations and kind of then just engage with the topic collectively. And yeah, we are fundraising today. We're going to drop a link in the chat. So we ask and invite that you engage. As of right now, these events are free. And, we just ask that you can donate where you can otherwise. So yes, and in terms of the tech, we're trialing this new platform for today's event. So we might troubleshoot some things, but in the meantime, we just invite I guess engagement where we can, and we'll troubleshoot. But otherwise, I now turn it over to Parth.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining. This is a lot of people. It's slightly intimidating. I just want to quickly say hi. My name is Parth. My pronouns are he, they. I'm an abolitionist, anti-colonial scholar, and man activist. And I'm joining you from India today. It's surprisingly sunny, even though there's really bad weather here in the south of India, where I'm joining you from. And just before I start and before we start having a conversation, I sort of want to ground this space with a positionality statement from my end. So I am a queer, non-binary, mad, disabled person. I have visual and psychosocial disabilities, if you want to categorize madness within that. But even though parts of my identity are marginalized, I also occupy relative privilege, being a fourth-generation academic, a light-skinned person with immense class capital from mainland India. And it's sort of important for you to know that context because while I'm speaking from a low and middle income country, while I'm speaking from the point of marginality, I still occupy relative privilege and I'm not a monolith for the communities that I'm representing. And it's with that sort of positionality and lineage that, I'm entering this space and that I want to ground my thoughts in as well. Let's start off with that. And today, we're talking about abolition, and I'm very excited because, again, this term tends to be scary to a lot of people. And a lot of people tend to get really uncomfortable with the word abolition. And Alex and I were just talking about what does discomfort mean and why do people stray away from discomfort. So today, at any given point, if you are wondering or sitting with that discomfort, I'll ask you to just stay with that as opposed to wanting to regulate yourself or another person and invite that discomfort because I think there's immense change that comes in from that discomfort within this particular space as well. It's good to also have some terminologies out of the way. So we are talking about the mental health industrial complex, and a lot of these tend to be academic words and words that are coming out of a very specific ivory tower. And today's discussion, I'm hoping that between Alex, John, and I is also accessible to a lot of you here and to us as well, and that we are not picking it in purely just an academic tone. So mental health industrial complex, just for those who are joining who might not be aware, is like any industrial complex is a business which gets intertwined with the socio-political components of the state, and then the socio-political components determine how profit is made out of that business. If that's too complex, think of the military. Wars need to happen to make profit for people who are within defense. Pharmaceuticals need to be sold for people who are running pharmaceuticals. Prisons need to be created so that there's an economy out of that can be created. So these tend to be examples of industrial complex. So when I was speaking of the mental health industrial complex, I'm largely talking about both how it intertwines with pharmaceuticals, how it intertwines with the prison system, militarization. It also like goes in with the authoritarianism that is here, with the tools that we are taught to understand as categories of mental health, be it the DSM or the ICD, diagnostics, therapies, and so much more, right? So this is the whole host of different industries that come together to create this mental health industrial complex. And then today, hopefully, we'll also talk a little bit more about how this mental health industrial complex works and who is the person who is benefiting from this, and can someone even benefit from the mental health industrial complex. Now, I also have a tendency to speak in 2x speed, so yeah, just ask me to slow down at any given point. Yeah. Any thoughts on this? Any questions?
I'm curious. What drew you into abolition? What's the charge behind abolition for you? Like, well, I'm curious what about your experiences and what brought you to this this particular position in relation to the complex and
Rage.
industry.
A lot
Rage,
of
yeah.
rage. I think I could tell people a lot of that there's sort of a manifesto rage that I operate with, which is just purely based out of existing within this like system. I grew up. Part of my lineage is also that I grew up in the military industrial complex within the country of India, where people from my family have either served or are currently serving within the military. And armies and the the idea of the military in itself is a very transphobic space, is a very casteist space, is a very racially charged space where again anyone who doesn't fit a certain amount of masculinity, doesn't fit a certain identity, or doesn't perform masculinity or gender in a certain way is automatically ostracized. So growing up within that particular industrial complex and being taught sense of ethno-nationalism of why you need to stand up for your country, what are borders that are there, and why it justifies people. Again, why it justifies violence to ensure that those borders remain the way they are, was a very big period of my life. And even within that, being queer, being non-binary, being trans, being someone with visual impairment and disability, you're automatically seen as the other who can be discarded or thrown away at the periphery. And within that system, any sort of deviance from the norm is automatically pathologized. So not only would behavior be policed, gender be policed, but at the same time, what am I allowed to read? What am I allowed to study? Who am I allowed to say no to? Became a very common part of that upbringing. And it was then when I also had experiences of psychiatric incarceration myself, of being a young person who was, being pushed towards a certain, or like certain image of what a child grown up in the military industrial complex needs to look like. And it was growing out of that the moment I had any sort of autonomy to escape that part. And I wouldn't say that I've escaped it entirely. I still owe a lot of my access and education to that particular industrial complex, and which is why I wanted to ground this discussion with that positionality statement to say this is historical access because of oppression systems like that, right? And today, a lot of my work in abolition is divesting from these identities and actively working on redistributing the resources that I get in terms of visibility, access, education, even money to people and communities that have been harmed by the military industrial complex at large. And to me, I also keep telling people that there's no single issue. So when I came in, I never came in as a mad activist or someone with lived experience. It was always from the queer trans movement. It was always from the disability movement, and sort of understanding what does it mean to be at the intersection of a lot of these different spaces. So once you realize that reform is just not possible in these spaces, right? You can't reform the police, you can't reform the military in the same way you can't reform an institution. Their abolition became the only way that I could potentially look at positioning myself. And I call myself a baby abolitionist because a lot of it is also just unlearning in terms of unlearning my own biases, my own privileges, and decentering that particular identity. That's what brought me into it, and it's just rage that keeps me going. John, if that answers the question.
Yeah, I think that the rage, it's such an important thing to catch hold of, and I think we find that with so many people in so many of these movements that arise in response to mental health industrial complex, with the anti-psychiatry movement, with the survivors move, the psychiatric survivors movements, the hearing voices movements. It's this the inevitable response to being pushed into these things and being subject to these systems, is this kind of just like unbridled rage. It is this, like, that is the starting point for so many people, and I think that gets so heavily pathologized, that rage responses, and rage in particular, and it's a particular violence. It's calling for a particular violence that is inevitable when you're being forced into these positions by a system that is so all-encompassing with society.
Bell Hooks said it, I think, really well, which is like the rage of the oppressed is never the same as the rage of the oppressor. It's always interesting to see whose rage gets pathologized by mental health at large, and who is at the receipt, and what does that pathologization even look like today. Like, if you talk about the queer trans identities being out of the DSM pathology, but then we're also looking at how any expression of rage by people who are within the queer trans community is automatically added into other diagnostic labels. So it's that it's not been depathologized from that manual, it's been very conveniently coded and categorized into other language. So it's that whose rage even gets pathologized within these spaces, right? Is always something which is very interesting to me. Yes, more outward facing rage to the empire is all I'm for.
Yeah, I'm staying with your mention of how perhaps it's conveniently or even covertly coded or codified still, how it might remain, even though it's not an overt diagnostic label in of itself. Perhaps it's still then, it creeps in, or somehow is still like maybe even snuck in other ways. And I guess, yeah, I'm just staying with that of how these systems, how these industrial complexes continue to reinvent themselves, or how they try to reproduce themselves. Oh gosh, maybe now I'm starting to get a little mad. Like I'm like feeling the rage a little bit. I just I felt a little like spark in my chest of then. I guess maybe I just wonder if I'm still staying with you and thinking about this, like the abolitionist practice of how can we stay mindful of this, or how do we still rage against this, and but also I guess the grief in this of like how it just happens, and it can happen in ways that then is rendered invisible. I don't know, and just how insidious.
It's that the invisibilization of rage is also very important, because I think of being angry or showing displeasure, discomfort, right? I think this is something that I constantly navigate with my own self. And again, this goes back to the fact that I've had access to education, and today with the global mental health ecosystem, I occupy a position of power where I have the language of rage. I can speak to you, to John, everyone here, in academic English, in a language which is my third or fourth language from where I'm from, and still convey a more sanitized, palatable version of my rage, right? Because as an individual today, that rage in this anti-imperial space is recognized. But what happens when violent resistance against settler occupation is rage which is not now comfortable, not now sanitized? What happens when rage which is happening against people who are within the police force is again suddenly seen as, rage that is no longer appreciated, no longer visible? What happens with rage which is not verbalized at all, which is existing within people, which is again manifesting in a lot of different ways? I constantly sit with the fact that who even has access to speak about rage, and in a lot of these spaces even resist, right? Like the language of resistance alone today has been co-opted by a lot of people who career activists of it all, who can position themselves as anti-imperial, anti-empire, can work towards creating, the spaces. But what happens when that language is just not accessible to people who are not part of this ecosystem? Like the fact that we are having this global conversation on a digital platform already creates an access issue for a lot of us from our communities who don't have access to internet, right? We're talking about in India specifically, where it's understood that, digital mental health and, the language of liberation and the language of care is accessible, it's universal. But we're talking about large communities that don't even have a single cell phone in the family, or even if they have a single cell phone, it's often with the patriarch. And if you are a girl child, you're not even afforded time on that cell phone, let alone the data pack to even have access to these languages. So when people talk about rage, I often think about the gendered intersections of it for people again, from the margins who are not part of the discourse at all. And how do we ensure that rage is recognized for all communities as opposed to some of us who are engaged with that?
Mm-hmm. Yes. Yeah, I'm staying with that of sort of how rage is recognized, and then how perhaps can we facilitate space, which I'm staying with, like that's perhaps even in the imagined or the imaginary. How can we imagine other ways? But just you say, like staying with the rage to begin with, because it might, I suppose I'm just thinking how it can emerge, just as you say, the language. Like we might not have access to such language, especially if we've stayed with this rage, if it's just stayed with us, if it's just been internalized, even like it's such, I guess, a felt sense in some way, or perhaps, yeah, I guess even the directionality too. I'm staying with how perhaps it's turned inwards and turned toward us versus, as you had said, actually, I think when we were speaking before, like externalizing, or no, just externalizing the rage.
A big believer of externalizing these systems, because I think as much as, yes, there are things that we internalize, things that we stay with, sometimes I think the most comfort I found is with externalizing rage with the community. Earlier this year in India itself, it was in the month of March, April, where India came up with a series of anti-trans legislations which got passed within the parliamentary houses of India and now in the process of becoming acts. And they erase entire communities from accessing gender-affirming care or even being recognized as people, as trans people within the country. So it's to say that the rage, as much as we all have felt that and have had that rage in us for a very long period of time, being a part of a country where authoritarianism is not new by any means, the fact that we were all there together, protesting in whatever way was possible. It was not all of us were not on the street at all times, but there were people who were protesting. There were people who were organizing digitally. There were people who were creating support circles. There were people holding each other during that particular time. As simple as people in mutual aid, being able to get people to travel cities and states in India to even come to a protest or sign a petition, right? So to me, like the rage doesn't always look like being on the streets at all times. Again, as someone who is disabled, it's not often that accessibility at all. But a lot of other spaces where rage can be shared with community. And I think that is a marker of change which really stays in imagining otherwise. Like, how can you imagine other systems if you're not able to be enraged with your community at all?
Yeah.
I loved what you, Parth, I loved what you said about who has access to rage, whose rage is legible, who has access to, like, I guess the ability and the language to express it, but also like whose rage is heard, and I love that you started with, or that you spoke about like childhood and children and I don't remember who. I remember where I was reading about, but I've been thinking about the concept of children as an oppressed class. Like there's we very often, I think, take for granted that there's this class of people that exist out there that are denied basically all of all of basic human rights, the ability of self-expression, the ability to be taken seriously in any means, the ability to make your own decisions, and I think for a lot of people, especially with how internalized the mental health industrial complex is, our anti-mad education begins at home, and it begins in just what is felt and treated as unruly in the parent-child relationship, and so much of that becomes so much of, I think so many of us that were like mad kids, and we're disciplined for being mad kids and brought into being a certain way. We had to internalize an anti-mad system, and a system which has all the way to uncriminalized unruliness from the start, and how deeply that shapes the way that we encounter ourselves and encounter other people and encounter unruliness in the world.
Oh, we could speak about this, I think, for ages, because I think here it becomes important to historicize some of these concepts, right? For me, being like an anti-colonial scholar, and I'm just talking about decolonization a lot, comes to the idea of why did children become an oppressed class? a lot of indigenous cultures from across the world, even where I'm from, like again, those who are practicing matrilineality, children were not seen as oppressed castes or
Mhm.
groups which were automatically to be diminished with capacity, right? Or to have evolving capacity within that particular space. I think
Mhm.
colonialism has a very, and eugenics specifically within that has a very important part to play here. I was talking
Mhm.
to a lot of people in terms, we had like a shared support circle for a lot of people from across the global south, where again, I'm using air quotes here to talk about language, which is also formed in oppression of understanding why it is so normalized to smack a child in an Indian household or a Kenyan household or a Nigerian household, or why is it so normal to have physical violence be part of your child rearing process, or the fact that this is part of the childhood to put people into place to discipline children. And
Mhm.
oftentimes people forget the fact that this was not always the case historically as well. If you look at how colonialism and specifically European colonialism took place,
Mhm.
the idea was to stay in line so that you and your family did not get targeted. And that idea of violence coming in from the European colonists, who again put people into places of how eugenics is. Slavery becomes a very important part here. Indians and indentured labor here for British colonialists becomes a very important part to consider here on who is the correct version of an enslaved person, who is the correct version of an indentured servant, and how did those things then get internalized within Black and brown families and still exist today in being put to line, in talking in a specific language, in staying within decorum, being disciplined, and so on and so forth. When we
Mhm.
talk about the coloniality of these systems, they've not just sprung out of, okay, thin air of, yeah, why are we asking children to stay disciplined? It's because they've come out from a whole system of thought that put people on a hierarchy of who's more human than the other. And the fact that today ABA is still and was for a very long period of time is still considered a best practice to sort of cure neurodivergent kids and to doctrine them into behaving like neurotypical children is still evidence of the fact that these things didn't come in from formerly colonized countries. These were Western psychiatry models that were created to oppress children into coming and becoming certain kinds. And I think this ableism, Sainism is what still continues to this day, right? Why do we still view rage as something which is pathological in children? The fact that juvenile delinquency as a word even exists within mental health or
Mhm.
conduct disorder exists goes
Yeah.
to show of how neoliberalism, capitalism, and colonialism intersect to form and create children as an oppressed class and want to keep them there. That they don't realize that, these are children with evolving capacity who tomorrow could have their own voice as well. I think, yeah, it becomes important to historicize a lot of these spaces and these conversations.
Yes. Mhm. Mhm. Yeah. I'm staying with that, and I had a reaction to, as you say, like, I guess anything that would exist that would cure neurodivergence like that. I could not register a reaction to that, and I suppose just something of difference in that, different ways of processing, different ways of being, different ways of thinking, and even going back to the child and something of play, like just play and in imagination and novelty and curiosity, like how all of those, I guess, threaten. I mean, they threaten these systems of power, these systems of oppression. I suppose how, yeah, just this idea of disciplining and violence, and just you say, I'm appreciating the importance of the historiosity. Like this didn't come from nowhere. These things were in fact internalized and practiced, and sort of, I guess, in the ways that we were talking about with the DCM, how these things then are rendered invisible, how that historiosity is, yeah, no longer evident as to where it came from. Um, and then two, I guess, how it can sort of project or portray sort of, these respective cultures as violent, when in fact the violence was enacted on them. It was like inflicted on them such that then, they engage with it in this way. But yeah, I don't know.
Mm. Think yeah, I think it's also important for me to foreground that the concept of if I'm like, because a tendency in a lot of discussion spaces tends to be that it's an either or binary, that either
Mm,
it was colonialism that was at fault and it's just that.
mm,
I wouldn't want to limit it to just that, right? For
mm,
example, caste in India has existed long before European colonialism even began. that casteism as a form of oppression has existed within the Indian subcontinent for much long before that. And that has a very specific kind of violence against a very specific kind of oppressed caste group, in like done by people from the oppressor caste groups as well, right? So the idea who becomes othered is not only European colonialism. So I wouldn't want to just reduce it to just a either or binary, but also be very cognizant of the fact that, like again, oppressive systems have created these hierarchies and continue to perpetuate them in some of the other format. So why does violence exist? I wouldn't go on to say all indigenous practices as a blanket are automatically safe. We're coming from a system in India specifically where a lot of shamanistic practices have a version of torture which are present within that. But what is often utilized by Western psychiatry or Western mental health as a part of the industrial complexes, well, that's the mystic shaman part, which is really spooky, and this is all the Orientalism of it all is going to make that dangerous. Whereas we, as a sanitized Western psychiatry of being in a bland white room incarcerated on chains, is suddenly not violent. So yeah, you sort of position the violence in the vantage point of who are you looking from and where does that particularly come from, right? And how do some of these other systems come into place? But I'm also thinking of play. Where is the third space today for children to play as well? Who has access to that particular space? And even like again, literacy becomes a very important part of childhood and play. Who doesn't even have language? Why are we taking language and knowledge systems away from children as a way to not let them learn? So constantly go back to the fact that the US administration wanted to run autism, reparenting camps. And last year, when the whole have paracetamol when you're pregnant and cause you to come have an autistic child, that epidemic, a lot of us from across the world who were neurodivergent were pushing back against that narrative, saying it's not just that that's coming from the West, it trickles down. There's legitimate evidence in countries where language of neurodiversity is not even there. Right? We are still reckoning with the idea of autism, ADHD, amongst many other things, as language which people can have access to. So when Western leaders make claims of that nature, there's a trickling down that takes place in a lot of different countries. And how is that not different from Nazi T4 camps or Japanese intermittent camps, of reparenting children onto a certain level? What are we reparenting them for? Are we reparenting them for productivity of a certain kind? So then are we looking at children purely from the ability for them to grow up and produce capital? And a lot of our countries and contexts, children are not even growing up to produce capital, right? If you look at what's happening in Bangladesh and India and the Congo, children from the ages of 8, 9, 10, 12 are already part of the economy of working, where it's no longer child labor from the very Western gaze, but there's actual labor taking place to mine cobalt, to create fast fashion, so on and so forth. So I constantly go back to the fact that when we even speak about children, who are we talking about? Here, who even has the opportunity to play? Will a fast fashion worker in Bangladesh who is 8 or 9 have that ability as well, or someone who's mining cobalt and have that ability to play as well? My thought process sort of goes a lot in those spaces.
Real quick, I just wanted to, I guess, just because some people trickled in after we initially. So for the first half of this, we're keeping people on mute, just for the sake of keeping privacy for the live stream. And in the second half of the event, we'll unmute everybody and everybody can join in. So we encourage you in this first half, please feel free to contribute via the chat. And then we'll open it up and give everybody mic privileges in the second half, if that's okay. But yeah, please chime in the chat. And we had a few questions in the chat that I wanted to highlight real quick. So Shreya says, hello, I'm a PhD scholar from India, really excited to be here. Could you please explain if there is a difference between the mental health industrial complex and the psi complex? Do you feel like those are meaningfully different for you Parth or Alex?
And again, semantics, we're playing fast and loose with how we define these things. It also depends on who created these terminologies. For me, the mental health industrial complex includes psychiatric complex within that, because I think anti-psychiatry and the mad movements have existed long before the mental health industrial complex became legitimate language out in these spaces of organizing. So wouldn't want to take away from those histories, but at the same time, foreground and say, the industrial complex in itself, when you say mental health, right? Mental health doesn't have any language. What is mental health? Are we talking about mental ill health? Then we're automatically going to the psi complex. If you're talking about pharmaceuticals, we're already going to the psi complex. If you're talking about mental well-being, we're going to the wellness industrial complex. So it's to say that how you understand position mental health becomes important. And I'll, Alex, what do you think?
Yes. No, I align with you, and I found myself even wondering, like when I considered psi complex, I'm like, oh, I wondered who's psi complex, like the operationalization of it. But to your point, like that respective epistemology, or that respective, I guess, system of knowledge, like who's psi complex, what psi complex. But then too, even as you spoke further, like just mental health. We all have a mentee. We all like that. It's in some ways it almost goes without saying, but something of even creating the creation of mental health as something that needs to be attended to, and then the industrial complexes as being the resources for this, for being able to offer this. Yeah, I kind of just stay with how they're almost part and parcel of one another, or feed into one another. And I would wonder too if like the mental health industrial complex, if these resources that it offers, or the diagnostics, the pathologies, if that is then internalized and creates this psi complex, that which exists in all of us.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think I'm also looking at like a lot of resonance for Lara's book, and that just gives me so much happiness.
Yes,
That's so much fun.
I was wondering
Just
about
wanted
that
to say
too.
that, yes, things are happening in the chat, which got me really excited. And I think it becomes important just to say that, who are we providing as, like, what is this product that the mental health industrial complex provides in terms of care, right? Is that care? We're looking at if you look at any brief psychotherapy intervention, which now, when you think of evidence and Western scientific evidence, or the RCT of it all, has the most evidence base, you're teaching people that you can have a very short-term support to then throw you back into oppression, and then you come back as a revolving door phenomena back to that short-term support, and then you go back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. That's the same thing with pharmaceuticals as well. I'm not anti-pill by any means. A lot of people support and live based on the medication that supports them. But we need to understand, why is it that it also becomes that concept of, thought-ending fallacy of, but what about the people who are on pills? But what about the people who benefit from psychiatry? We're not taking away any of that. People still benefit from oppressive systems. Doesn't mean oppressive systems need to exist. Take a step back and ask, why was it that the pill was the first way a child who was a teenager, going through oppression, or someone who's a young adult going through oppression, could have a solution through a pill or a brief psychotherapy, where they're again isolated and taught that the way that you think about the world is perhaps wrong. To me, that baffles me a lot, because that's something that I've also gone through personally as well. Is say that, think about queerness or trans identity. Well, you need to think about it differently, and the world is just, going to be like this. No, that's not the true at all. The world was never like this in a lot of spaces. And why are we normalizing oppression and imperialism to a point? Well, if the world is going to be like this, might as well just find quick fixes to take away from that. So I constantly think about the fact that a lot of people internalize the psi complex and say, and I'm not putting that onus on them by any means, right? We internalize carcerality so much. I tell people that a big part of abolition, at least for me, was to kill the cop within me. Take that cop out of my own thought process, psyche, my own knowledge systems, and then potentially move forward. Until the time I didn't take the cop out of myself in a lot of different ways, I couldn't even exist within that space without feeling very strong dissonance with what those values were. So yeah, I think I keep telling people, like, okay, the difference between both the complexes I wouldn't want to create a binary between them, but at the same time, try abolishing the cop in you that holds on to these systems as the only way of support that can be potentially provided.
Yes. Let's see. I was just looking in the chat still. Tina's mention of common sense is carceral. Yes, I appreciate that. Something of, I guess when I'm thinking with that, like common sense is something not to be questioned, or common sense as though like one should just have this. Like, oh, use your common sense. I don't know. I guess I'm reminded of how we've been speaking into this. Whose common sense? What is common of it? Like what, I guess, and how that can kind of keep us imprisoned, or can keep us bound to something.
Common sense is really just the most like It's just the most like base default to what is like inherited knowledge. It's just what has been like
Yes.
the most mass reproduced throughout society. And it's like if it's just an appeal to that. It's just an appeal to what did you inherit without questioning. I think any like appeal to common sense. I think when people speak to common sense, they're trying to tap into like the, oh well, there's this innate knowledge that we all have, but it's like no, there's no knowledge that's innate. It's all filtered through something or another. And specifically like common sense in reference to the mental health industrial complex, like common sense is what's been shaped by that complex. And yeah, I'm a big anti-common sense guy.
No, it's the same here. I think the moment people say like, oh, it's second nature for them to call the cops when someone is going through a crisis, it's like, why didn't you just phone 911, like 911 in the West, or call like an emergency center here in India? My thought process goes to, why was that the most default for you? Just because it's standard procedure, what does that even look like? Why is coercion the default for so many people within the mental health industrial complex? And why is coercion normalized as, inevitable? The myth of inevitability here to say that, well, the cops have to show up. That's what they're for. They're not for that by any means, So I think it also takes a point of where do we look and what gaze we're also operating from. I'm also seeing in the chat like a comment by Bhavya which talks about how even like patriarchy is gendered here. So I go back to common sense here, quite a lot of thinking whose labor is invisibilized. I think within the global south, global majority countries, or just care work in general, is a very gendered terminology. And it's very true, and what Bhavya has also brought up in the chat, that the way that we think of the mental health industrial complex, some people are just bound to take up the load. So I constantly go back and say this, not just the service user or the person with lived experience or the person being coerced, who's the person being oppressed. The people who are cogs in this machine are being exploited as well. You ask any person who's working in a facility or an institution, the load that is on them to, take on that amount of caseload, that amount of work to, again, restrain people. They're not coming out of that feeling, oh, I'm just feeling the best about myself. This is what I want to do with my life. It's a question on, why am I being asked to take 10 to 12 clients a day if I'm working OPD? Why am I asked to restrain another person? Why is there no amount of questioning that I can do to the system without a fear of losing my job? Why is it that my education is training me to coerce people and to pathologize experiences that I wouldn't pathologize in myself or my family members? So it's not that those two things are similar in terms of playing field by any means, but I will say that the mental health industrial complex goes on to oppress every person part of it. It's just that people don't recognize that oppression at all. And some things are invisibilized. For example, the gendered aspect of care work within that space as well.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm thinking of how, I mean, this comes back to Foucault has been talking on this for forever, on like oppression isn't just what we classically think of as oppression, as like a violent forcing down of something. It's also like oppression and power also manifest in the way that we're shaped. It's like power shapes people in a way that is invisible, because when we are shaped a certain way, we take that as normal. And I think so much of our like normal, like you're saying, so much of our normalized way of being the world, that is how we were shaped. It's not general, it's specific. It's specific to something, and it has a texture, and it has its restrictions. And we just like, if you were to wear a straitjacket for long enough, you get used to the sensation. And we get used to these things, and we get used to the restrictions, what it's like to be conditioned in that way. So yeah, it's not. I think when people think of oppression, they think of it like being like this violent outwards force. It's like, no, power like shapes you in ways that you don't notice and don't think about.
I'm going to butcher this entirely, but I remember an excerpt from Asata Shakur's autobiography that's coming to me, where she says that to go, like, again, to first understand how to fight slavery, you need to know that you are enslaved in the first place. I'm butchering a very long text into a very small version, but yeah, I think it goes back to similar things that you're talking about. Once you're in the straitjacket long enough, that only feels like the only option that there is.
Yeah, and I'm even going back to, as you kind of like opened our session of like with the lineage statement, like something as you say, like when we're in these systems, we're all in like respective. There's a situatedness, but in these different degrees, there is still oppression. We are being oppressed in these different ways, and we're kind of being implicated to reproduce this oppression in some way if we are working within these systems. And I guess, John, as you say, like power shapes, I guess I was thinking how privilege shapes as well. And like really, I guess, tending to and taking up the situatedness, and how we can speak into it, or how we can trouble it, challenge it, and also return to the collective and not stay in our respective, like, being removed of one another. And I hope this isn't going off too much, but I kept thinking of resilience when you were speaking, and it's something I think on often, of what resilience does, and how, like, especially in these sort of like capitalistic, these systems of oppression and power, of how if they demand resilience, if we just stay, I don't know, I guess if we just bear with it, we bear and deal with it and not call it into question. I guess I was thinking of common sense in that way too. Like, just use your common sense, just be resilient, just stay with it, like, just come back. But then how, when we return, we might be weakened, and then we can't challenge it, but just like staying with this. What are we staying with, even? And to what end? I don't know.
A personal vendetta against that word resilience. I think it just riles me up more than anything else, because I think it goes on to the point of, I had once, like when we were talking again about gendered minorities within the country of India, and within what's understood as the country of India, we were talking about how it's understood that, you need to just inherently be resilient, and that's the allyship model which follows. The people who are allies to people with mental health conditions, when we're talking about just allies to people who are oppressed, they want to see you be resilient, and they want to, it's almost pornographic in the way that they want, the gaze of resilience is that, yes, let's, see you bounce back. And the amount of ableism there to see a person with a disability navigate an ableist society, or a person who has mental health condition navigate a sanist society, and then come out of it as if we have persevered, as if there was no other option. I constantly go back to the fact that, what are we supposed to do? Are we supposed to just die? I mean, what else? What other option is there for us to, not exist? And who benefits from this model of resilience, where interventions and care models and research is created in a way that constantly positions people who are oppressed to stay within that social order and be resilient enough to stay there?
Yes.
A lot of interventions and research wants people to be within that particular plane. Like we were talking about children as well, that's like a lot of research would say, yes, we have interventions to support them, but we still don't want them to have agency and rights. We want them to stay with marginal, reform within their particular oppressed class as well. So I constantly go back to the fact that resilience wants you to put a bow on your own prison and say, be happy that there's a nice pink bow on your prison. That's the amount of customization you get to your own incarceration. That's about it. Exist within that silo. We would not want to decenter our privilege or break apart from that to let you have any rights. Because again, that threatens the establishment, right? I speak a lot about discomfort in the same sense. Why is discomfort so difficult? Because it threatens your identity, or what calls a lot of identity. The anti-psychiatry movement threatens psychiatry because people rose into positions of power with only their technical expertise of being doctors as their only matter of identity. Similarly, today, when you think of the prison abolition movement, it goes to people who are cops, and the state's threatened identity of, oh, but we have worked so hard to protect and create these systems. But are you, like, again, flattening your own identity? There's one power of oppression that you have. And why is it so quickly, I'm also loving the chat that's coming in. Why is it so quickly threatened by any form of another person having human rights? I mean, Pedagogy of the Oppressed, there's work for Fanon that's there, which talks about this. There's a bunch that's coming in even now from people who are mad activists from across the world, or people who are indigenous activists who speak about similar things, of how resilience is often construed to create a class of its own where you can stay oppressed.
Yes. I'm checking in the chat again.
We see this with, I think resilience is a big one. I think we're seeing this. So there's a new term. I don't know if y'all are familiar with actually Cass, who's in the chat. We did our first Deliberate Mental Health event was on necropolitics, and I'm coming around full circle back to necropolitics in my current research. And there's a new word going around. People talk about necroliberalism. And I think we're seeing with the like widespread. So for people that are unfamiliar with necropolitics is in essence, sorry if I butcher this, it's in essence the governance of who lives and who dies beyond just like the biopolitical, but it's about the creation of death worlds. And the example that Mbembe gives is Palestine. Palestine was this death world that was created by Western imperialism. And it's about the essentially, so necoliberalism. I'm reading and writing about this. It's necoliberalism is the government, is the form of government that emerges as necropolitics becomes widespread to the whole world, and it's essentially capitalism's triage system of deciding who's going to be worthy of life and who's going to be worthy of saving as we enter into global polycrisis. And I remember where I was going with this, but there's like words like resilience. So resilience is a hangover from neoliberal ideologies. We're no longer arguably in the era of neoliberalism. We're in the era of necroliberalism, and it's going to have its own systems of governance, which are more about how do we kill off as many people as possible and keep the semblance of this small semblance of society alive. I think resilience is one big hangover that we've all internalized as like a valorized, as we've revalorized resilience so heavily. I think one thing that Lada's book, really, Lada and Stephen, their first book before it was Psychoanalysis Under Occupation, before it came out, before their current one. But they talk about dialogue, and there's this constant impetus for the oppressed to dialogue with their oppressors. And dialogue serves a similar function of like it's this valorized. So you need to be a civil person, that you need to die civilly. You need to die and be subject and enter in and be human. And you see again that category of the rational human at work as this form of governance. I think there's so many of these. There's so many of these terms that the mental health industrial complex, like you said, it teaches us to internalize our own docility, and we're seeing this shit doesn't cut it in the era of like global polycrisis. I think a lot of people are starting to more heavily reject it because we're seeing that like, oh no, it's just a new form of control.
Oh, you've spoken my language. It just gives me, if you didn't see me already smiling ear to ear, this just gets me so happy, because I constantly want to sort of bring necropolitics through the mental health industrial complex, and people sort of get, again, they put their defenses up as to why we're talking about necroeconomies and necropolitics, even though that's coming from a very specific understanding of how it was created around death wars as well. Like bringing it back to the necroeconomy or mental health as well, who like just incarceration alone, like you're looking at creating a class of people who are incarcerated because they are not able to provide to a certain capitalistic economy within the country, who doesn't have voting rights, whose rights are constantly being erased. And going back to the conversations of necropolitics as well, I constantly think about a very easy example that I give to explain this to someone is the language around suicide prevention and suicidality in general, right? Look at the mental health context of committing suicide, which a lot of people forget has roots in the transatlantic slave trade, to now dying by suicide. What does dying by suicide mean? I'm sorry, but does someone just passively die by suicide as if it was their choice to end their own life, as if the systems were not oppressive enough that was the only thing that the person could do was take their own life. So today, when I'm talking about, again, the necropolitics of language, I'll constantly go back to this passivity in language that we're teaching people. Be more, trauma-informed, for the lack of a better word, where, again, in italics of what that word means, is to say, sanitize language and say, person's not committing a crime when they, are taking their own life, they're dying by suicide. I'm like, okay, no, what if we start reshaping that language and say people are being killed by the state? Why does that suddenly make you so uncomfortable if you're listening to that? Does it now put the onus on people who are actively supposed to be responsible for taking care of the citizens, right? And then the conversation on necropolitics is really interesting to me, because people then tend to understand the necroeconomy of suicide prevention itself. And it goes back to the history of it all, right? If you look at the transatlantic slave trade, like, again, colonists and slavers who are keeping people enslaved on ships, actively coercing them, chemically restraining them, force feeding them so that they don't lose slave value when they go into the colonies, and people were taking their own lives. You're keeping people alive for racial capitalism. That's the same thing today as well when you think of productivity. That's why I love when you spoke about necroliberalism, because I was like, yes, more people. If that's, I need to know more about your PhD topic as well, research topic as well, because that looks so interesting. Yeah, that just got me a lot of joy. Just wanted to say that.
Yeah, I'm reminded in a provocation of yours that you had mentioned necropolitics, and this was my first encounter with it for myself. So John, when you brought it in, I'm appreciating that. And like, as I say, even relative to like, I mean, resilience, it's valorized. It's been, I don't know. And Parth, even as you said, like to the point where like, what do people just die? Do we just expect them to die? And then that's kind of, I guess, how resilience sort of this pipeline to necropolitics, I would think, or something of that. And I guess I'm staying with, as you mentioned too, the passivity of language. And I guess I'm also staying with like reparations and taking accountability, and I suppose how language can play a role in that. Like, how is it that then we revise this language to place the accountability where it belongs, to actually like, name the violence, make very visible the violence, and I suppose the discomfort in that, but staying with the discomfort of that. And I've been thinking quite a bit about like even regulation, like in the mental health industrial complex, of like how there's this call to regulate and to self-regulate, and in terms of coping, and like to what end, but also just, I guess, regulation, like what that does, the surveillance, the control, how we take that, how we're charged to take that in, and how, in order to regulate that what means to control our feelings, to control our rage even, and for who and for what. And I've been trying to think for myself of different ways of saying it, like not using regulating anymore, but having to go beyond that.
Yeah, I mean, the chaos of it all. No, we were talking about this earlier as well, that regulation in itself has a policing element to it. Policing of any nature brings with it a level of violence that makes the masses act in compliance with the state. Now, break that sentence down into any industrial complex, and you can see mental health literally manufacturing consent for that particular word. Like, I mean, the fact that it's on everyone's, like whoever has access to the language uses it to, okay, let's regulate each other, or let me check in with you and let me provide a trigger warning. Nothing against these words. If you look at the history of, again, trigger warnings appearing on early versions of the internet, where people would have narratives of violence against them, and other people would access those narratives of violence, the idea of trigger warning was to let you know that you're coming across a really violent passage on early versions of the internet being documented. Today, the way that has been co-opted by the mental health industrial complex, as if you're infantilizing an entire adult human being into thinking, let me prep you with all sorts of comfort before giving you any sort of a version of discomfort that might threaten your identity. And to me, that's bizarre. What is the need and the fixation for us to be regulated at all times? And who does it threaten? If I'm dysregulated at work, it threatens the people I work with because I'm not working up to what I was employed for.
Right.
If I'm dysregulated in the family system, it threatens the idea of a well put together family system, that it suddenly becomes pathologized by the model of mental health. If I'm dysregulated out in the world, what does this, again, my idea is who's policing, is understood here. And that's why I go on to say that any mental health professional, as nice as they are, as anti-oppressive as they are, the moment they ask their clients to regulate within the session, you're a cop in a cardigan. You're sitting very nicely on your comfortable chair, and you are a cop within that particular space. You could be a really good cop. And I maintain that in my work as well, that a good cop is still a cop.
Yes.
You can be a very nice cop, an anti-oppressive cop, one who is, really going through anti-racist, anti-caste trainings. But the moment you sit there and ask your person who is coming there for support to breathe and to contain themselves, you've already occupied their body in the way that the state is occupying the body. So, what is the fixation with regulation? And to me, when someone asks me to regulate, I'm less like, oh, someone asks me to take a deep breath before a session starts. I often want to let them know the rage that will follow is not going to be fun to look at. And that's why I preface it with a linear statement as opposed to anything else, because I'd rather have discussions grounded in reality of where we are speaking from, as opposed to this, performance of safety. Can we be safe in the system? And currently looking at the global polycrisis, also what John mentioned, are we supposed to be saved? I don't think we're supposed to be regulated. We're looking at active genocides on our screen. We're looking at quite literal fascism, which is creeping across the world, gender rights being rolled back, and the idea that today the environment is not feasible to live in. I'm sorry, but we don't need to be regulated. We don't need to be calm. We don't need to be well adjusted in the system. And again, regulation doesn't mean passively just staying there and listening and consuming things. Regulated in the sense of what does dysregulation threaten, particularly here. Also recognizing that.
Yes.
Yeah, I wanna bring in Amy. Amy's brought some good counterpoints for us. Amy they first responded, resilience is bigger than capitalism. Everyone has resilience as their birthright. It's about aliveness, connection, not endurance. And then further down, regulated doesn't mean calm. And I think these are good counterpoints. I think it's good to notice. I think a lot of us, I think that especially that have been harmed by mental health systems, our immediate like gut reaction is to go to like a further swing to the other side of like fuck all these words to full on reject them. But also like I think there's the other answer here is to reclaim them and to notice that like these it's not so much that regulation and resilience are bad altogether. It's that they've been weaponized by people in power, and they've been weaponized along systems of power. But there are ways that we can, and I think it'll be good. Amy, I'd love to get your perspectives as we open it up in the second half here on how do we harness these things? How do we harness them and uncouple them from the ways in which they've been hijacked, and the ways in which they've been taken over by institutions and used to just reproduce the norm.
Yes.
It's rarely flattened to the identity of just mental health that we're talking about. Someone who is, let's say I'm going to talk about communities that I am part of. If someone is queer, trans, disabled, and a survivor of psychiatry or a person with experience, we're not only asking about why psychiatry harmed that person, we're talking about how these interconnected systems of oppression work. So to me, one thing with understanding how of reparations, one, just want to foreground by saying the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disability, if you're looking at international human rights instruments, has reparations as a part of it. If you're a person with disability, technically states need to be providing reparations. So it exists in the language of human rights. Now let's talk about the reality of it all. We all know that that just doesn't work. Lived experience is now barely coming to the idea of co-production and equalizing epistemic authority to say that people with lived experience of mental health can be co-producers of knowledge, can have their own knowledge systems, can provide a pushback against Western clinical colonial knowledge systems as well. To me, that's not enough, right? Because again, we're now looking at commodifying lived experience as a product that I can give to you. And you can pay me. I can be a lived experience expert. I can suddenly say that my history of incarceration can provide an expertise. But to whom? The moment I'm working with an INGO like the WHO, or I'm working with an INGO or a larger academic system, if I'm not sanitized, palatable, if I don't make my lived experience very nice and shiny, story of resilience, where I've suddenly had a narrative arc, I'm automatically not viewed as sanitized enough for lived experience to be another word. So to me, I understand lived experience of what? Reparations within this space is not a new concept. Reparations has existed in a lot of different oppressed communities for the longest time. When you look at indigeneity, when you look at the land back movement, the way that I want to equalize this is by saying if someone comes in and says, I'm on the occupied lands of so on and so on and so, you're acknowledging the fact that you're a settler. Are you part of any reparative model where you're giving the land back? I'm not talking about giving people who are indigenous from that region economic support temporarily as, okay, here's a token of some money, but are you actively giving the land back? Or are you only limited to a land acknowledgement statement? When we're talking about caste oppression, climate oppression, when we're talking about reparations in a lot of these spaces, are we actively looking at atonement? It's not about remuneration, right? Reparations is not about the fact that harm was done and now it can be quantified to XYZ amount for one person's life because one person can be commodified. It's about the fact that can oppressive systems even acknowledge that they've done harm? Can they even atone for that? So with lived experience, I often wonder, if you look at lived experience-led research in mental health, right, most of it is non-contractual. You're being remunerated, but you don't have contracts which have conflict redressal in them, contracts against harassment, contracts that have housing, welfare, well-being as a part of them. You're given gift cards for your participation in a lot of spaces. And as much as the language is becoming better, people have more opportunities to be dual researchers and join and assimilate into NGO systems, etc. Do you have welfare enough that you can sustain your life without these systems? Or is it understood that to be a person with lived experience to be valued at all, you need to assimilate into academia, into the NGOization of it all, and only then can you be valued? So I often want to problematize lived experience by asking reparations for what? It's not to quantify an amount and say, here you go, even though you can quantify harm that people have gone through and people have done it. There's really good research coming out of Australia which talks about how reparation works there. There's really good work coming out of how reparations for colonization have worked. But again, to whom, right? If you look at, there's a whole we can have a whole conversation on anti-colonial reparations. Reparations are given to Israel. So what does that mean, particularly, by a lot of countries in the form of aid? Humanitarian aid is a form of reparations within international human rights systems as well, right, in global economies. But do the Romani people who are also part of the Holocaust get any form of reparations in Europe? It's a good sort of thought exercise to go back and check and see whether that happens or not, or was it only white Europeans who were part of the Holocaust who get reparations in the form of now their state being funded. Similarly, which are the colonies that don't get reparations at all? If you look at India, the reparations that Britain could provide would be a marginal population of India's GDP, right? It wouldn't even qualify as much as a fertilizers budget that India spends. It's also important to know that it's not about the amount as much as it is about the atonement of harm. Can people even acknowledge that they have been oppressive in the first place?
Yes.
So, yeah.
We already see that discourse.
That gets me, a lot.
Yeah.
We already see that discourse getting hijacked with who's the fucking UK politician who's talking about India needing to pay the UK reparations for their
Honestly, yes.
investment
Thank
in
you,
India.
because you created, you enslaved us, created our train systems, and suddenly we need to be very excited to pay you back. Yeah. That got me so that was so funny because I was telling people the historicization again here is not present, right? If you look at British colonialism in South Asia, particularly India, the train systems or language was not created for us. It was created for goods to be exported out of our lands to the British economy. In the same way that Western psychiatry was not created for us. I mean, a good example of this I give people, which I write a lot about, is when large-scale Indian revolution took place against the British, they created immediately after that the Indian Asylums Act. And after they created that act, any people walking across the street that they could see as deviants against the British Raj, they would put them in psychiatric incarceration and then subsequently experiment on them. And then particularly also, they would do then carpet weaving, masonry, and other forms of capitalism within that particular industry. There's a whole asylum industry that existed that provided economy to the British Empire. So sometimes when I think about it, I'm like, okay, open the schools, get people reading, because why are these parts of history not even being taught to the people? But colonists are asking for colonized countries to provide reparations. Like, that's just funny in so many ways.
Yeah, they're trying to control the narrative. They're trying to talk about it in capitalist language, which is in terms of global investment and in terms of returns on investment.
Yeah.
And
No, of course. And forgive me, I was going somewhere with that too. But yeah, it's also something of like I guess a red herring or like a logical fallacy, like still like using their respective systems and staying, as you say, within like a capitalist rhetoric, where it's like, oh well, we've invested in you, we've invested in your economy, we've, as you say, but it was created for exploits, nay exploitation. But no, I mean that has no place in the language. It's a return of investment. We've invested in you, and so then we expect these investments back. It's like, that's who invited you here. No one.
This is 250 years of the American independence goes on for the same rhetoric as well in terms of who invested into the land. I mean, the way that immigration is understood, and we're talking a lot about like the riots that are taking place across the UK or the US in anti-immigration riots, which are there, to foreground them as well, and to say that why are people now suddenly afraid of immigrants? It's as if we were brought there to support post-World War II economies, within the UK at least. Like, you needed immigrants from formerly colonized countries to come and support the economy in a post-World War II UK. No one chose to come there and say, yes, leave our lands and come there. That was the way that your countries could survive, like when we talk about the UK. And still people, race riots are framed across a certain narrative. And I think it's the same thing. We're living in a post-truth world where a lot of fascism is run on narrativization of a lot of these things, where you can create a certain false narrative and have people buy it. Which is why America is considered a land of the immigrant, where are the immigrants? It was settler colonial, slave-owning people that came in, colonized that particular space, and then there were anti-immigration policies against people who were Asian, Southeast Asian, etc. And now again, we are a land of immigrants. But it's interesting language to me. I often go back to the fact that, to me, since English is not my first language, I'm often very fascinated with how it's weaponized by a lot of these narratives, right? Specifically in the mental health industrial complex as well. Who gets to use a word? And it goes back to, again, claiming, reclaiming. I think about the fact that can I even reclaim a word in the colonizer's tongue? Do I even want to, for that matter? That'd be resilience, regulation, mental health, anything of that nature. I doubt if I want to, but I wouldn't, A lot of thoughts around that. I don't know where I was going with it, but yes, everything came together.
Yes, I'm sharing all of those thoughts. I'm sorry to jump in, John, but I was noticing the time. I was just thinking that perhaps we take about, a 5-10 minute break? What do we feel?
5, and then also should we share the links again for the?
Yes, I was just going to share the fundraising links again in the meantime. So yeah, we'll take about 5 minutes. We'll turn off our mics and cameras, and then we'll come back at 10 past the hour, and then we'll invite it in for open discussion.
Yeah. I'll also, so I'm gonna add the live stream here. So if you're still watching the live stream, and if you had a change of heart and you want to join us on the conversation, I think there's about 15 people in the live stream there. If you wanted, you should also have the link for the live room. So if you want to tune in for that, we're ending the live stream just so that we can have a more private conversation for the second half here, so that people can unmute and have the privacy of knowing that it's unrecorded. But if you're watching the live stream now and you want to join us in that second half, please join the Jitsi link in the event description. And yeah, also just one more reminder on the fundraiser. So in lieu of, and those of you who joined late, in lieu of ticket prices, we're fundraising for a friend of Parth's, or a comrade of Parth's,
Yes.
queer comrade. Who's Parth? Could you share a bit about their situation and
Yes.
what they're fundraising for?
India has unfortunately had a series of anti-trans legislation, because of which a lot of people, specifically from multiple marginalized identities who are also trans and queer, for example, those from religious minorities, are targeted. This particular fundraiser was for a trans comrade, queer trans comrade, who is looking for rehabilitation. In case this is not accessible, and if you're still interested, connect, and we can always connect you with people. Any amount is always preferred. Thanks.
Awesome.
Okay.
See you all in a bit.
5, and yeah, we'll see you all in a bit.